For this video, I want to share my experiences with some of the most popular community fish in the hobby to try and help you find the perfect stocking options for your aquarium. I like to only talk about species that I personally keep, and I have all of the featured fish in my aquariums at the time of recording. I know that this is a long video, but everything is timestamped below so you can skip to specific sections if you like. I do want to quickly touch on community tank layering, as it's a great way to add movement and colour to all levels of your tank and add as many fish as possible without overcrowding. The concept is very simple but often overlooked, and you simply choose species of fish that tend to stick to a specific layer of the water column in your tank, with each species chosen occupying a different layer. For example, you might want something like chili Rasboras that tend to stay near the surface of the aquarium for your top layer. Then you might want something like Neon Tetras, which are usually towards the middle layer of the tank. Finally, you may want to add something like Corydoras, which are bottom dwellers and tend to stick to the substrate layer of the aquarium to finish things off. As you can see in the example on screen, this lets you have 3 different species in your tank that tend to stick to their own layers within the aquarium. As I work through the video, I will be going over the specific layers of the water column that each species tends to occupy in my aquarium, so you can use this strategy in your own tank. First up, we have Guppies, and they are one of the most popular fish in the aquarium hobby, and it's easy to see why. They are easy to find, cheap, and bring a lot of colour to your tank while also being a highly active species. However, due to decades of inbreeding, finding healthy guppies can sometimes be challenging. To avoid overpopulation in my aquariums, I only keep male guppies, as they tend to be more colourful than females, and it completely removes the overpopulation risk because of their prolific breeding. Fortunately, guppies have coexisted peacefully in my tanks with a lot of the other species of fish featured in this video, including shrimp. That said, it is worth noting that female guppies can grow to nearly twice the size of males, which means their larger mouths may pose a greater risk to smaller tank mates such as shrimp. As you can see in the video footage, male guppies do often chase each other and display tail fanning behaviour, but this is simply how they establish their dominance hierarchy, and they generally ignore all the other species in the tank. I've seen a lot of people say that guppies stick to the surface layer of an aquarium, but mine do explore the entire water column and will happily swim through all 3 layers of the tank, filling up all the available space. Currently, I have 4 male guppies and around 100 cherry shrimp living in my 25 litre or 6.6 gallon tank, and they seem to work very well, and they should be fine in any tank larger than this. Guppies do naturally prefer hard water setups, and while they can survive in soft water, the weakened genetics of modern guppies mean this may increase the risk of health issues in the fish. If your tap water is soft, you can add a limestone based rock like Sirius stone to your aquascape that can boost the hardness of the water, as it will slowly release calcium carbonate into your tank. When it comes to feeding, guppies are incredibly easy to please. Mine have eaten almost everything I've offered to them, and as omnivores, my guppies will often feed on soft algae types and detritus in the aquarium. Personally, I like to target feed them using nano or microgranule fish foods as their staple, but they've ate almost anything I've gave to them, and I do often see them picking at algae and detritus. Although guppies are not a shoaling fish, in my experience they are a social species and they tend to prefer others of their kind in the tank. I have 4 guppies in this specific tank, and they do seem to be doing well, but the smaller tank size does have to be factored in. The guppies I've kept in larger tanks always seem to do better when they are kept in groups of 8 or more, as it seems to reduce the amount of chasing and tail fanning in the tank. Although guppies can be kept in community tanks, personally I think they look better if you just get more guppies for the tank, as they'll occupy all levels of the water column. There's plenty of colour varieties out there to keep things interesting, and they are very active swimmers. Next up are Neon Tetras, another iconic, very popular species in the aquarium hobby that's known for their stunning blue, red and white coloration. While they are often described as a shoaling fish, my experience has been quite different, and they seem perfectly fine going off and doing their own thing unless something in the tank startles them, and then they will group up. On the topic of being startled, my Neon Tetras are very skittish and very easy to scare. Something as simple as the high activity levels of my Corydoras or Harlequin Rasboras spawning can be enough to cause the Tetras to just go off and hide in the plant cover. Ideally, if I did have the space, I'd love to set them up in their own dedicated tank where they could freely swim around without feeling stressed by more active species, and that is on my to-do list in the future. That said, I have previously housed them in my old 29-gallon tank without the Harlequin Rasboras, and the Neon Tetras were far more visible and seemed more confident exploring the tank. Unfortunately, like Guppies, the popularity of Neon Tetras has led to decades of inbreeding to meet demand, resulting in weaker fish. I experienced around a 40% loss with my batch of Neon Tetras, and judging by local reports from other fish keepers, this is considered a good survival rate for the species, but this will depend on your area. In my opinion, a small group of Neon Tetras would do well in a 10-gallon tank, as they are nowhere near as active as some people suggest, but a larger tank would be better if you have the space and budget. My Neon Tetras have always stuck to the bottom half of their tank, and it's extremely rare that I see them venture towards the surface. When it comes to water conditions, Neon Tetras are generally considered a soft water species. I've always kept mine in tanks with a pH below 7.0, but this is mainly due to my soft tap water. In my experience, they can be slightly more difficult to feed than Guppies, as they typically eat from the middle and lower sections of the water column and rarely pick food off the substrate unless they are particularly hungry. Finding a slow sinking food is a good way to make sure they get their fair share of the food, but I've been using frozen Daphnia or frozen Cyclops recently and letting it just filter around in the water floor, and the Neon Tetras love it. Just like most other shoaling fish in the hobby, a minimum of 6 fish is usually recommended, but I did start with 10. Next up we have Cardinal Tetras, which share many of the similarities of Neon Tetras, but they do have a few key differences. Visually, the most noticeable distinction is that Neon Tetras have a white belly, while Cardinal Tetras have a red belly that runs the full length of their body. Cardinal Tetras generally prefer slightly warmer water than Neons, but there's enough overlap in their temperature requirements to comfortably keep both species together, as I do in my tank. Cardinal Tetras do usually cost a little bit more than Neons, but they do usually have a higher survival rate, which helps balance out the higher cost. However, they do grow slightly larger than Neons, so I'd recommend a minimum tank size of 20 gallons, but larger will be better. Aside from these differences, all the care tips and observations that I mentioned for Neon Tetras apply to Cardinals as well. Next up we have celestial Pearl Danios, which are a stunning little fish, and it's no surprise that they are rapidly growing in popularity. Personally, I do think a lot of the viral photographs online of celestial Pearl Danios have been touched up with software like Photoshop to make them more colourful and vibrant, but they still look amazing. These tiny little fish are always on the move, which makes capturing good photographs and video footage a challenge if you're using your smartphone like myself. The males have a really cute sparring behaviour where they circle each other, wagging their tails for a couple of seconds before they dart away, but unfortunately I haven't managed to catch this on camera yet. In my experience, celestial Pearl Danios have been very hardy, but this could be due to the recent supply issues that the species has faced, because suppliers did seem to struggle to keep up with demand. They are definitely increasing in availability these days, so that could result in health issues in the future if suppliers keep inbreeding them over time. So far, I've only kept my celestial Pearl Danios with Neocaridina shrimp, and while all the adult shrimp in here are safe and accounted for, I haven't had any baby shrimp yet, but some people have said that their CPDs have eaten baby shrimp. Currently, mine are in a 25 litre or 6.6 gallon tank, but I am planning to upgrade this as soon as possible, probably to a 45 litre or 12 gallon tank, as they are very active and would definitely benefit from the extra space. My celestial Pearl Danios usually stick to the bottom half of the aquarium, and it's very rare that I see them any higher than that. There's a common misconception that celestial Pearl Danios need low pH water because they originate from Southeast Asia, but the only documented test of their natural habitat's water returned a pH of 7.3. That's why I've added some Sirius stone to their tank to gently increase the pH, but in all honesty, very little is known about their ideal water conditions in the wild. Since celestial Pearl Danios are tiny and usually average around 1 inch in size, you really do need to find a micro-sized granule food. I currently feed mine NT Labs micro microchrom, as it's easy to find here in the UK, and Horizon Aquatics will ship it to the rest of Europe if you are struggling to find something your CPDs will consistently eat. If you're over in North America, then the new Aquarium Corp Magic Small Fish Feed looks almost identical to the NT Labs microchrom that I use, so in theory it would work just as well, but I'm in Europe and it's not available here to try. Again, a minimum of 6 fish is usually recommended for most aquarium setups, but I would always try to keep more as these are so small. It is worth noting that celestial Pearl Danios can be kept in a room temperature aquarium like this one that I kept throughout the winter, where water temperatures maintained around 18 degrees Celsius and the fish had no problems. Next up are chili Rasboras, and again it's easy to see why these tiny fish are so popular, especially when they have fully coloured up, but unfortunately there's a lot of contradictory information out there on what actually gets these fish to develop their bright red hue, and I honestly don't know why sometimes the red and other times the orange. Thankfully, most of the time, at least in my aquariums, the majority of them have their deep red hue, which contrasts very well against the green aquarium plants in my tanks, making them pop and stand out. Just like celestial Pearl Danios, chili Rasboras used to be difficult to find in my area due to supply issues, but thankfully availability has improved, leading to lower prices and easy access to this fish. These little guys have been extremely hardy in my experience, but just like a lot of other species that are extensively bred on fish farms, their genetic strength could diminish over time. While these are still widely known as chili Rasboras, their actual scientific classification was changed to Boraris brigitae of the Boraris genus. Now the Boraris genus does include 6 recognized species, with some of them looking very similar to chili Rasboras. Personally, I do think at least one of mine is actually a strawberry Rasbora, as they are very similar and mislabeling in pet shops is common, but these fish are without a doubt the most peaceful species I've ever kept, and they just keep themselves to themselves even in my large 40-gallon tank. They really like occupying this top right hand corner of the tank where there's plenty of plant cover, and they rarely venture into open water, so I would recommend you offer plenty of hiding spots and cover. I do think their shy nature may be because they are the smallest fish in this particular tank, and while I've never seen any of their tank mates be aggressive towards them in any way, the fish obviously don't know this, so I do think they would be more confident in a species specific setup. I've kept my chili Rasboras in a 40-gallon, 29-gallon and 12-gallon tank, and they always seem to keep to the upper half of the water column. Chili Rasboras are usually considered to be a soft water species, but just like some other featured species in the video, there is a distinct lack of solid information on their natural habitat. This is partly because the exact collection sites are a bit of a mystery, and there's a lot of confusion with the other Boraris species because the fish look so similar. Feeding these little guys was a challenge back when I first got them because they have an even smaller mouth than the celestial Pearl Danios, which made finding a suitable food tricky. Thankfully, that's when I found NT Labs microchrom that I mentioned earlier, which is easy to find here, but if you are in North America, then the Aquarium Corp's Magic Small Fish Feed looks very similar. Just like most shoaling fish, it's usually recommended that you keep at least 6 of them together. I have 10 and one of my friends has 25 in his tank, and their behaviour is still very similar to mine. Next up are Corydoras, and I personally have albino Corydoras aeneas, but there's an absolute ton of different varieties to choose from. That said, the Corydoras genus went through a lot of recent reclassifications that have shuffled a lot of scientific names around, but a lot of shops still just label them up as Corydoras. My Corys live a very simple life based around searching for food, eating the food, then they'll have a rest, and then they'll try breeding, and then they just repeat that cycle constantly in my tank. As I mentioned earlier, I keep albino Corydoras aeneas, which are apparently a lot more prolific when it comes to breeding, while other species of Cory may not breed as frequently as these. I did lose a couple of my Corydoras aeneas when I first got them, but I'm not sure if that's because of this specific species or if it's because I bought them from a particular chain store here in the UK with a semi-controversial reputation. However, the ones I have now are thriving, and I've seen a lot of other people say their Corydoras are hardy and easy to keep. These guys are very peaceful bottom dwellers, and they spend the vast majority of their time sifting through the substrate looking for food, but they will randomly dart up to the surface of the tank as they can process atmospheric oxygen. The larger species of Corydoras like these are usually better suited to 29-gallon tanks or over, but there are a few smaller species in the hobby that can be kept in smaller tanks. Now, different types of Corydoras are native to a very wide habitat, meaning their ideal water parameters can vary widely depending on the specific variety that you keep. Many Corydoras species do tend to prefer lower pH tanks, but Corydoras can handle pH levels up to around 7.5, with some native populations living in 8.0. One of the best things about Corydoras is just how easy they are to feed, and they'll eat almost anything you try with them. That said, contrary to what I've seen some people say, Corydoras are not algae eaters and they seem to prefer a high protein diet. I regularly add vegetables or leaf litter to my tanks for my shrimp and my Siamese algae eater or snails, and my Corydoras completely leave it alone where they are on any food that is high in protein as soon as I add it to the tank. Next up are honey gourami, and these are my favourite fish to keep in the hobby by far. I absolutely love their bright yellow coloration, and unlike a lot of other gourami species, these little guys are very peaceful. Unlike most fish, gourami have modified ventral fins that let them act as little arms that they use to feel their surroundings, and if you keep multiple honey gourami, they tend to pat each other as if they're saying hello. I've kept honey gourami in a few different community tank setups now, and they completely ignore their tank mates, making them an excellent fish for a community setup. My honey gourami have been in tanks with literally hundreds of shrimp, and I've honestly lost count of the number of times I've seen them swim right past baby little shrimp without even trying to eat them. Honey gourami aren't technically a shoaling species, but in my experience they are definitely a social species and seem to prefer having other honey gourami in their tank. And unlike a lot of other anabantoids, they'll tolerate having multiple males in the same tank with minimal issues, making it very easy to keep them, as it can be challenging to work out if you're getting male or female honey gourami from the shop. But one of the best things about honey is their natural adaptability to water parameters. Just like most fish that are native to India, Bangladesh and parts of Nepal, they are particularly hardy due to the annual monsoon season that causes drastic fluctuations in their water parameters. These changes include spikes in toxic ammonia and nitrite levels in their tank, making honey gourami more forgiving for water quality problems common for beginners. In my experience, honey gourami really aren't picky eaters either, and they've eaten almost anything I've added to the tank. Next up are Medaka rice fish, and ever since I started keeping them last year, they've quickly become one of my favourite fish to keep. There are technically hundreds of different colour varieties available, but unfortunately these are usually restricted to Japan and certain parts of Asia, but they are slowly becoming more popular and easy to find in the West. I know that Medaka were quite pricey last year, but improved supply chains and more local breeders seem to have helped keep the prices down more recently, making them far more budget friendly. On top of that, despite the amount of selective breeding within the species, Medaka do seem to remain impressively hardy. One of my favourite things about Medaka is that they are perfectly fine in a room temperature tank without a heater, as they are native to Japan. It is important to note that there are some other types of rice fish in the hobby that are from tropical regions such as Indonesia and Thailand, where they will need a heater, but Japanese Medaka rice fish are fine in a room temperature aquarium. I currently keep platinum, orange, black and tricolour varieties of Medaka, all housed with shrimp and snails without issue. They tend to be very peaceful fish, and from what I've seen, they just like to swim around the tank in their own little world doing their own thing. I do keep small groups of them in my 25 litre or 6.6 gallon tanks, with my 29 gallon tank serving as a grout tank for my baby tricolours that I hatched last year. I've seen a lot of people claim that Medaka tend to stick to the top layer of the aquarium, but in my experience this is not the case, and they will happily swim through all layers of the water column without issue. Just like the other nano fish that I featured in the video, they definitely usually do best when fed small foods like NT Labs Microcrumb if you're in the UK or Europe, or Aquarium Corp's Magic Small Fish Feed if you're in North America. These aren't true shoalers, but they do seem to be social fish, and while they are perfectly happy to wander off independently to explore in the tank, if something startles them, they do seem to prefer having other Medaka in the aquarium. Next up is the Siamese algae eater, and personally I quite like the shark-like appearance of this species, but it is important to note that these can get as large as 6 inches when fully grown. Beyond their looks, they are very popular in the hobby because they will happily eat a wide range of different algae types, including stubborn varieties such as blackbeard and staghorn algae that a lot of other algae eaters simply ignore. That said, just like most other popular algae eaters, Siamese algae eaters will tend to eat other foods that they can find, particularly granules or vegetables or leaves that I add to my tank, and the algae is a last resort, so it might be an idea to manage their food levels if you need them to eat algae. I've only ever kept one Siamese algae eater, but from what I've seen from other fish keepers, they do seem to be a hardy, easy to care for species. One common issue is the confusion between true Siamese algae eaters and lookalikes such as the Cambodian logsucker, often referred to as the false Siamese algae eater. Unfortunately, mislabeling these in aquarium shops is pretty common, and I've seen it happen in my local area twice now. It is easy to tell them apart if you can see photographs of both of them side by side like on the screen right now, but in my opinion the easiest way to remember the difference between these two fish is that a true Siamese algae eater will have the black line run all the way through its body including its tail, whereas a false Siamese algae eater doesn't have the black line on its tail. From what I've seen online, other species such as the regular flying fox, the silver flying fox and Chinese algae eaters can also be missold as Siamese algae eaters, but they look very different, so it's easier to tell them apart. I honestly think that these misidentification issues are one of the main reasons why there's so many contradictory reports about the amount of algae these fish will eat as well as how they'll interact with their tank mates. My true Siamese algae eater is very peaceful, and it spends the majority of its time just grazing on food and then resting after a meal. It's actually quite cute to watch because it'll come down off its perch, eat some food or go exploring to see if there's anything available, and then after a meal it goes back to find a nice leaf to rest on. As I mentioned earlier, these fish can get to 6 inches in length once fully grown, and I keep mine in my 40-gallon tank, which I'd recommend as an absolute minimum for this species as they can be active when looking for food. Mine is usually in the bottom to middle region of the tank, and it's very rare that I see mine anywhere near the surface unless it's snacking on some algae on hardscape elements that are placed high in the tank. These fish are native to a wide range across Southeast Asia, and they naturally live in both soft and hard water environments. As I mentioned, they're not really fussy eaters either, and mine have eaten everything from fish food that I intentionally add for the fish to leaves and vegetables that I add for my shrimp and snails. He just eats everything. One of my good friends has a couple of Siamese algae eaters in his 300-litre tank with a bunch of Pearl Gourami, and even though he has multiples of the species in there, their behaviour is almost identical to mine, so I'm not sure if they are social fish or if they just don't care if they're kept by themselves. Next up are white cloud mountain minnows, and I'm personally a huge fan of these little fish. There are two main varieties commonly found in the hobby, the standard white cloud and the gold white cloud, which I personally keep, but there are some selectively bred strains becoming increasingly popular, with the meteor minnow being the most popular one, but there are a few other different types out there. White clouds have a reputation for being a particularly hardy species of fish, and despite decades of inbreeding due to their limited wild populations, both of which are now protected, they have managed to retain their resilience. These minnows are easily some of the most active fish I've ever kept, and they are constantly on the move, making it fun to watch their tank because they're always up to something. As soon as I added them to my tank, the males began sparring for dominance to establish their hierarchy, and then they started to breed, and within a month I had baby fry swimming around in the tank. Currently I keep mine with Neocaridina shrimp and ram's horn snails, but I haven't had baby shrimp in this tank yet, so I'm not sure how the minnows will react to them. My white clouds are housed in a 12-gallon or 45-litre tank, and while they do utilise all of the available space when moving around, I would love to upgrade this to a larger tank in the future. My main problem is just finding the space. Unlike species such as Neon Tetra, which occupy a similar layer in their tank, my white clouds will frequently explore the substrate looking for food and feed directly off the substrate. At first I was feeding these a mix of NT Labs Nanotropical and Fluval Bug Bites Light Blue label because of their smaller granule size, and they did seem to enjoy it. However, I did notice when I was feeding the babies the NT Labs Micro Crumb, the adults started to go wild for it, so now that is their staple food. I don't actually think this has anything to do with taste either. I personally think it's the tiny particle size triggering the prey drive in the white clouds, making feeding more exciting for them so they become more active. One of the best things about white cloud mounted minnows is that they will happily thrive in room temperature aquariums, which helps keeps your costs lower because you don't have to heat the tank. Again, just like a lot of other shoaling fish, it is typically recommended that you keep at least 6 white clouds in your tank. However, if you have a well-planted, species-specific setup like mine, be prepared for a population increase as mine started to breed within a month of being added to the tank. Finally, we have Harlequin Rasboras, a species that I personally think is underrated in the hobby. These guys are cheap and easy to find, and they become very active when spawning. I know that their coloration doesn't appeal to everybody, but I personally quite like the subtle pink hues that they bring to a tank. There's also a couple of different selectively bred varieties available, such as these purple Harlequin Rasboras I recently saw at Horizon Aquatics, but unfortunately the lighting wasn't the best, so you can't see how good these fish actually are in the clip. I originally purchased 15 Harlequin Rasboras just over a year ago, but I currently have 9 left. I did go through a strange period of losses with these over the course of around 3 months, where I lost one every couple of weeks with no visible signs of infection or anything like that. I'm really not sure if it was a problem with the tank or if it was just bad luck and everything lined up in a short period of time. Thankfully, I haven't lost any in months, and from what I've seen other people say, most people do find Harlequin Rasboras to be a hardy, easy to care for species. One thing that I do like about this species is that they strike a nice balance between being active and being timid. Unlike some species that are either constantly darting around the tank or constantly hiding, Harlequin Rasboras have a moderate in-between behaviour. Mine tend to be calm and relaxed after eating a meal and tend to occupy the middle of the water column, slowly swimming around, but they will chase each other briefly to establish their hierarchy. Once they start spawning, they then become hyperactive, and the females will lay their eggs under the plant leaves in your tank. My Harlequin Rasboras do happily group up and shoal at times, but it's very unpredictable, and I honestly don't know why they do it, and I do think it's just something random that spooks them, then they'll shoal around the tank. As I said though, this is unpredictable and not an expected behaviour that you should have for this species, so don't pick them up just because you've seen people post shorts on social media of them shoaling around the tank. Mine are currently in my 40-gallon tank, and they do make full use of the space when active, but I do think they'd be fine in something like a 29-gallon tank if you have less space available, but I wouldn't go any smaller. My Harlequins are very enthusiastic feeding, and it does seem to scare some of my more timid fish away during feeding time, but this is easy to fix, and I just add food to multiple locations in the tank at the same time. These little guys have a widespread natural habitat across a huge range in Southeast Asia, so just like some other fish, they are quite adaptable to a lot of different water conditions. And again, just like most shoaling fish, people usually recommend you keep a group of at least 6, but keeping larger groups will usually make them more comfortable and active in the tank. So that concludes my experiences with all of these different fish. As I mentioned back at the start, I did try to include the different levels of the water column that the fish tend to swim in, so you can plan a layered stocking system in your aquarium. Provided your setup can handle the bioload and maintain safe water parameters, this will let you put more fish in the tank without overcrowding a specific layer of the water column. If you are new to the hobby, I'd recommend you try and stick with species that are cheap and easy to find in your local area, while also being hardy and easy to keep if possible. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope you found it helpful. There is a ton of other community fish out there in the hobby, but like I said at the start, I only like to speak about species that I've personally kept. Thanks for watching guys, and have a good day.